Welcome to CozySideAudio, where every story pulls you deeper. If you like the thrill, the mystery, and the chase, like, share, and subscribe before the next clue disappears. CozySideAudio presents Solitary Gardens. Chapter 1: Arrival at Dawnbloom Station. I have always believed there are places in the universe that feel like they've been waiting for you. Space is so quiet, so impossibly patient that stepping into them feels less like arriving and more like remembering. Dawnbloom Station was one of those places. I didn't know this the moment I saw it from orbit. From up there, it looked like a glass spine laid across a pale, crater-pocked moon, the structure too long, too delicate, a shimmering curve hugging a landscape that seemed equally unwilling to be touched. Lumen 6 was smaller than Earth's moon, and yet felt vaster. Its horizon pulled tight, its plains unfurling in pale silvers and blue grays. The white dwarf star it orbited cast a thin, lavender light across the landscape, light that never looked quite strong enough, almost as if the sun here was tired or humming quietly to itself. The pilot of the shuttle didn't speak much. Most crew members weren't trained to converse with the people they dropped off at remote outposts. We were solitary by job description. 7 years alone with a greenhouse on a quiet moon didn't attract extroverts. "Docking in 5, he finally said, his voice filtered through the calm with an edge of static. "You'll need to secure your packs." I already had hours ago. I nodded anyway. The docking arms of Dawnbloom Station reached for us, magnetic locks snapping into place. The shuttle shuddered, then stilled. I pressed my palm against the window and tried to comprehend that this lonely, elegant structure would be my entire world for the next 7 years. 7 years. Sometimes it was hard to reconcile the knowledge that other people marked 7 years with marriages, divorces, new children, older children, graduations, deaths. Meanwhile, caretakers like me marked 7-year intervals with plants that grew too fast or too strangely, climate graphs, atmospheric fluctuations, and long video logs that no one but the next caretaker would ever watch. "You're free to disembark," the pilot said. "Good luck, Dr. Lawless." "Thank you," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure he heard me. He didn't look up again. The airlock opened with the kind of slow, deliberate movement I associated with old machinery. Dawnbloom Station was old, one of the first terraforming greenhouses built off-world, its engineering outdated, its structure patched with decades-old repairs. But it remained functional. Gloriously, miraculously functional. A wave of warm, fragrant air brushed my face the moment I stepped inside. It startled me enough that I nearly dropped my bag. The temperature inside the greenhouse, at least in the entry module, was far higher than the specs had indicated. My lungs filled with air that carried the scent of damp earth, something floral, something sweet. It didn't smell like a lab. It smelled like a place alive. My boots thudded softly against the grated walkway as I moved deeper, past the decontamination arch and into the main vestibule. My helmet visor slid open, recognizing the oxygen levels as safe. I inhaled again, slowly this time, letting the scent settle. "Dawnbloom Station welcomes caretaker Amy Lawless," said a soft, mechanical voice. The station's aging AI. I'd read about it. It didn't do much anymore. It monitored environmental systems, but its personality functions were disabled after a glitch several decades ago. "Thank you," I said anyway. A polite acknowledgement to a machine that couldn't appreciate it. But politeness mattered when you were alone. It shaped the silence into something less hostile. A corridor branched to my left toward the maintenance hub and personal quarters. Ahead, the main greenhouse doors waited. Tall, curved panels of reinforced glass, fogged slightly from the humidity behind them. I hesitated before opening them. Not out of fear exactly, more out of reverence. The station had existed for nearly 40 years, maintained by 8 caretakers before me. Each of them had stepped through these doors for their own reasons: curiosity, restlessness, escape, ambition. I wondered what the station had given them in return. My hand hovered above the panel. "Here we go," I whispered. The door slid open. Light bloomed around me. Not the sterile white light of laboratory grow lamps, This light was softer, warmer, scattered through humid air rich with motes of drifting pollen. The greenhouse was enormous. Vast arches supported the curved ceiling, allowing unfiltered light from the dwarf star to mingle with damper glows beneath. Pathways branched in gentle arcs. Vines hung like curtains from elevated tiers. Sections that had once been partitioned, the temperate zone, the tropical wing, the arid section, had blurred together, boundaries eroded as if the plants had simply refused to stay within assigned boxes. A pulse of deep blue light flickered across a cluster of broad-leafed flora. I blinked. Bioluminescent fungi, I murmured. The leaves shifted color again, blue to pink, pink to an ember orange, before settling on a muted green. I took 2 steps forward, and the plants reacted. It was subtle, a ripple through the leaves, as if a very gentle wind had revealed itself for the sole purpose of acknowledging my presence. But there was no wind. The station's ventilation system didn't generate directional airflow that dramatic. Not unless there had been a malfunction. I set down my pack, crouched beside the large-leafed plant, and extended a finger toward it. "Hello?" I whispered before I could stop myself. The leaf nearest to me warmed in tone. Greener, brighter, almost as though it blushed. I told myself not to anthropomorphize. Scientists weren't supposed to do that. But 7 years ago, when I accepted this post, I knew exactly what I was signing up for. Isolation twists the mind into wanting company anywhere it can find it. Still, plants didn't usually change color in real time from a single breath. "Probably photoreactive pigments," I said, as if reciting to a classroom. A blossom nearby unfurled slightly, petals spreading with a soft crackle. My heart fluttered. "Okay," I whispered, standing slowly. Not unnerving at all. The station hummed quietly around me, the low resonance of generators, soft mechanical breaths of hydroponic pumps. But the dominant sound was the living hum of the greenhouse itself. A chorus of tiny noises, stem friction, subtle leaf movement, the almost audible expansion of buds. I stepped deeper in. The temperature envelope shifted. Warmer, sweeter. The smell tugged at a memory of a garden I visited when I was 8. A greenhouse in Montreal with olive trees and orchids, a place where the world felt held in a bubble of humidity and green. But Don Bloom Station was stranger. And older. And wilder. I reached the central walkway, a metal spine that wound between raised beds and hydroponic terraces. Something brushed my arm. A vine, curling slow and deliberate, had lowered itself from above. It didn't touch me, but it hovered close. "Curiosity," I murmured. "At least you're not hostile." I reached for my wrist scanner, set to environmental analysis mode. "Let's see what your chlorophyll expression looks like." The vine curled back slightly, as if bashful. I froze. "That's impossible," I muttered. Plants didn't behave like pets. Or people. Unless the caretaker logs had been right. I remembered the file summaries. Unexpected adaptation. Autonomous crossbreeding. Unusual responsiveness. Words vague enough to hide meaning. I swallowed. "Let's just start at the beginning," I told myself, and the plants and maybe the entire station. I found the main data terminal near the core atrium, a circular space overgrown with tall tree-like flora whose branches glowed faintly, veins of bioluminescence pulsing along their trunks like slow heartbeats. I activated the terminal. It flickered to life. Caretaker identity confirmed. Dr. Amy Lawless. Rotation term. 7 years. Cycle count. Remaining 2,804 sols. Sols, not Earth days. They always use sols here because time moved differently. Lumen 6 had 80-hour rotations. Days stretched long enough to make your thoughts feel slow, like honey trying to remember how to flow. I exhaled. This was real now. This was home. The terminal booted the internal log system. A small window blinked. "Would you like to record your first entry?" I glanced around the greenhouse. The tall bioluminescent pillars seemed to sway almost imperceptibly. Waiting. "Yes," I said softly. The terminal chimed. "Begin recording." I started, then cleared my throat. Arrival log, Don Bloom Station rotation, year 0, day 1. This is Dr. Amy Lawless. I hesitated. The greenhouse appears stable. More than stable, actually. It's thriving. A vine behind me rustled softly. I'll need time to map out the adaptive growth patterns, I continued, trying to sound clinical. There are signs of hybridization. The boundaries between sections have eroded significantly. I'll run diagnostics later today, after I settle into quarters. The leaves behind me shifted again, and I looked over my shoulder. They leaned toward me. Just slightly. Environmental quality is far above baseline expectations, I said. Temperature is higher. Humidity too. But everything reads safe. I paused. And I inhaled. It feels alive here. More alive than I expected. Silence, except for the hum of bioluminescent trunks. I'll conduct a full structural sweep soon, I said. End recording. The terminal beeped, recording saved. I slid my pack onto my shoulder and began the trek toward the living quarters, small utilitarian cabins attached to the maintenance hub. As I walked, more plants shifted, tracking my movements, adjusting their poses like animals waking up to a new presence. I tried not to let it get to me. Phototropism, I murmured. Thermotropism, mechanosensitive responses, just plants being plants. But I had spent years studying plants on Earth. They didn't move this way, not at this speed, not with such certainty. I reached the corridor connecting the greenhouse to the living quarters. It was cooler here, the air less humid. The shift made my skin prickle as if I'd stepped from a hot bath into a cold hallway. My quarters were simple. A bed, a desk, storage compartments, a tiny bathroom. On the far wall, a circular window looked out at Lumen 6's horizon. The lavender light from the dwarf star washed across the plains in an otherworldly glow. I set my belongings down, unstrapped my coat, and sank onto the bed. The silence felt denser here, less alive. I rubbed my palms against my knees and exhaled. 7 years. I whispered to the empty room. 7 years with no other human voices, just mine, and whatever the greenhouse offered in reply. I stood, unable to sit still. The quiet of the living quarters unsettled me in a way the greenhouse didn't. I opened the door again. Warm, fragrant air washed over me immediately. It almost felt like the greenhouse was waiting for me to return. I stepped back inside, drawn by the pull of the living space. As I walked, I spoke aloud, not to break the silence, but because it felt strange not to. This is going to take some getting used to, I said softly, running my hand along a railing where vines clung. I hope you don't mind company. A cluster of small, soft-petaled flowers near the base of the path brightened by a few lumens. Just a flicker, a subtle shift in the glow. I froze. Okay, I said under my breath. That's new. The petals dimmed again, like an exhale. I crouched, slowly, very carefully. Are you responding to me? The flowers trembled, barely, a vibration so small that I questioned whether it was real or imagined, but the timing was too precise. Right, I murmured. Either you're extremely sensitive to vibrations or... I didn't finish the sentence. Scientists shouldn't fill the unknown with assumptions. The greenhouse had decades to evolve beyond its blueprint. A sealed ecosystem adapting without oversight, hybridizing, mutating, forming complex webs of interaction. Whatever you are, I whispered, I'll figure you out. The flowers pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat hidden in petals. I felt my chest tighten with something that wasn't fear, something closer to wonder. Connection. Recognition. A ridiculous thought came to me, unbidden. They've been waiting for someone to talk to. I rose to my feet and looked out across the greenhouse. The glowing trunks, the hanging vines, the drifting motes of pollen swirling like dust caught in a sunbeam. I guess you and I are stuck with each other, I said. The vines above rustled gently, like soft laughter. I didn't smile at first. Not until I realized how much the sound comforted me, how quickly the greenhouse had shifted from foreign to familiar. I took a slow breath. Tomorrow, I whispered. We'll get to work. Behind me, a faint cascade of light rippled through the leaves, warm gold spreading in a wave from one plant to the next, as if the greenhouse were releasing a soft, contented sigh. It was the closest thing to a welcome I had ever felt. And in that moment, I knew the truth. Dawn Bloom Station wasn't just alive. It was listening. Chapter 2. The greenhouse that grew without permission. I woke to warmth on my face. Not sunlight, not exactly. The dwarf star outside didn't shine bright enough to feel warm through glass. No, this warmth came from the greenhouse itself, from the humid breath of plants that had claimed the air like a body claims heat. I sat up slowly in my bunk, my hair sticking slightly to my forehead, my shirt clinging to my back. I had meant to do a full station sweep the night before, but exhaustion had stolen me early. I didn't even remember lying down. My boots were still half-laced, my hair still in a loose braid. The greenhouse must have lulled me in some strange way. Or maybe the quiet finally caught up with me. "Morning," I murmured. Not to any person, of course, but because silence can feel too big otherwise. The room didn't answer, but the air vent made a soft, content hum, and for a moment I let myself pretend that was enough. I pulled on fresh clothes, tied my hair up, and stepped into the corridor connecting the living quarters to the greenhouse. The shift in temperature hit immediately. The quarters were cool, the greenhouse radiantly warm, almost welcoming. As I approached the main chamber, the wide glass doors slid open, and the greenhouse breathed around me. Light drifted inside in soft, swirling particles, pollen or spores, suspended in air like dust in a cathedral. The bioluminescent trunks glowed a dim, dreamy green, their pulse-slowing rhythm matching something almost like a heartbeat. Mine? Theirs? Hard to tell. "Okay," I said under my breath. "Day 2. Let's see what you've been up to." The greenhouse didn't respond, not verbally at least, but a ripple went through the leaves overhead. Subtle, precise, too controlled to be chance. I opened my tablet and began a new log entry. Observation log day. 2. Caretaker Dr. Amy Lawless. Notes. Temperature elevated above baseline by +4 degrees C. Humidity tilde 87%. Light levels inconsistent. Bioluminescence active outside expected cycles. Flora boundaries appear dissolved. I lowered the tablet. Time to map the sections. Every greenhouse built during this era had 3 main zones: temperate, tropical, and arid, each meant to mimic the ecosystem settlers might one day bring to terraformed colonies. But Dawn Bloom Station had been wild for decades, and I knew from the archives that its ecology had become complicated. Still, I needed to understand the collapse of boundaries, so I followed the old signage, rusted metal plates with fading lettering. Section 1. Temperate. The entrance arch was still intact, if barely. Ivy-like growths tugged at it, creeping over the sign like curious fingers. When I passed under it, the air shifted, becoming cooler and scented with something crisp and familiar. Deciduous leaves, damp moss, the rich loam of a forest floor. Trees rose around me, oak-like but wrong in small ways. The leaves had fine iridescent edges, like the shimmering sheen of insect wings. The trunks glowed faintly just beneath the bark, as though they drank the dim starlight and exhaled it back. A ground shrub near my left ankle quivered. I stopped. "Easy," I whispered, just passing through. The shrub's leaves fanned out, wide like a startled animal flattening itself. Then, just as slowly, it relaxed. Photoreactivity? Thermoreception? A response to vibration? I crouched and reached toward it, but before I got close, a puff of pale, shimmering motes released from its center. Whoa! I leaned back as the motes drifted toward me. Not away. Toward pollen, spores. They behaved like neither. They hovered in the air as though evaluating me. My fingers tingled where a few landed on my skin. "Curious little guy," I murmured. The motes bobbed once, almost like a nod, and then dissipated. I exhaled. "Okay, science later. Don't die before breakfast." I rose and moved on. The walkway curved through a patch of tall grasses, towering stalks that swayed without wind. They turned in unison as I passed, like a field of heads tracking movement. "I see you," I said softly. The grasses shimmered a faint gold. Section 2. Tropical. The transition was not subtle. Heat washed over me in a humid wave, heavy with the scent of nectar, sap, and something citrus sweet. Tropical biomes needed more water and heat, but this was beyond expected parameters. Thick, breathing warmth like walking into a sauna alive with color. Enormous broadleaf plants, some with iridescent patterns like stained glass, towered above me. Vines hung in curtains, trailing bioluminescent beads in blues and greens. Orchids grew in clusters, petals shifting their hue in slow gradients. A vine descended from above. Slow, deliberate, sinuous. It curled downward like a curious serpent, stopping just inches from my shoulder. I lifted my hand. Not touching, just looking. The vine's tip rotated, orienting itself toward my palm. Following heat, I speculated aloud. Or motion. It drifted closer. So close I felt the faintest brush of air the movement it caused. I lowered my hand slowly. The vine followed. When I stopped, it stopped. I smiled, breathless. Okay, that's new. I moved my hand left. The vine followed like a compass needle. I moved my hand right. It followed again. I moved my hand up. The vine hesitated, then reached. Chronotropic behavior? I wondered. Heat signaling? Sound anticipation? As I spoke, the vine twitched slightly, almost perked. You can't be reacting to my voice, can you? The vine curled. Okay, I whispered. We'll come back to you. I backed away gently. The vine slowly retracted, returning to its perch in the canopy. Some part of me, irrational, childlike, felt as though I'd just promised a new friend I'd visit again soon. Section 3. Arid. The arid wing should have been dry, minimal, spare. Instead, it was a thicket. Succulents burst from the soil in spirals of geometric beauty. Cacti stretched tall with translucent spines that refracted the light like tiny prisms. Flowers, bright cyan, almost neon, blossomed along the path, their petals wide open toward me. "Hi," I said, because silence made me feel impolite. The flowers tilted. Not toward the dwarf star's light source. Toward me. I stepped back. Their petals followed my retreat like satellite dishes, tracking a signal. "That's not phototropism," I whispered. "You're tracking heat, aren't you? A respiration. Or," I placed a hand on my chest. "Heart rate?" The petals quivered, shifting toward me with delicate precision. My pulse jumped. The flowers leaned in. "Okay," I muttered. "That is beautiful and mildly terrifying." The petals continued following until I turned swiftly and walked away. They tried, but couldn't pivot fast enough, and finally stilled. As I reached the central atrium again, I stopped under the massive glowing trunk of one of the centerpiece flora, those strange hybrid tree systems that looked as though someone had combined mangroves, banyans, and bioluminescent reef coral, then left them alone for 30 years. "You're all changing faster than you should," I whispered, sweeping a gaze across the entire greenhouse. In the dim, pre-lunar night glow, the plants almost looked like they were breathing. First samples. I made my way to the small side lab attached to the main greenhouse. It was old. Microscopes slightly fogged around the edges. Sample trays scratched from decades of use. Logbooks filled with cramped handwriting from caretakers long gone. I pulled a fresh kit from storage, cleaned a surface, and began taking small samples. Leaf shavings, trace spores, a tiny clipping from the vine that followed my hand, a petal fragment from the heat-reactive arid flowers. I slid each into labeled vials. "Sorry," I murmured to the plants themselves. "Just science. Nothing personal." A soft rustling sounded behind me. I turned. The broadleaf plant from earlier, whose leaves changed color, had leaned slightly into the lab's doorway, watching. With no wind. No pressure differential. No mechanical cause. "You knew I took the clipping," I whispered, "didn't you?" The plant shimmered green, pale, warm, almost forgiving. Something in my chest tightened. "I'll put it back when I'm done," I promised. The leaves softened in tone, and the plant withdrew, whisper sketching. After running initial scans, chlorophyll variation, spore density, cell structure imaging, I opened the station's old caretaker sketchbook. The first few pages held botanical sketches decades old, neat scientific drawings with labels, cross-sections, diagrams. I flipped to a clean page. I began sketching the vine. My pencil moved almost on its own, tracing the elegant taper, the small hollow nodes that dotted its surface. "Your internodes don't follow Fibonacci patterns," I murmured. "At least, not Earth Fibonacci." I paused. "Do you have your own?" I sketched the arid bloom next. As I drew, I found myself talking, not to fill the silence, but because speaking aloud made the observations feel shared. "Your petals are too warm. You're practically reading my pulse," I whispered to the drawing. "How are you doing that?" The greenhouse answered only with soft rustling. Still, it felt like a conversation. The night hum. By the time I finished sketches and samples, the greenhouse had slipped into lunar night phase. Lumen 6 rotated on its slow axis, casting the station into long, dim hours that were neither truly night nor truly dark. That was when it began. A hum. Low. Resonant. A frequency more felt than heard. It vibrated in the floor under my feet, in my ribs, in the back of my teeth, like distant machinery, but not mechanical. This hum had variation, tone, almost warmth. "What is that?" I whispered. The leaves nearest me trembled softly. The bioluminescent trunks brightened in slow pulses, synchronized with the hum, like lungs expanding on a silent exhale. I stepped to the center of the atrium. The hum deepened, wrapped around me, nested in my chest. It felt comforting. Ancient. Alive. I pressed a hand over my heart. "It's beautiful," I breathed. The pulse brightened, almost as if the greenhouse acknowledged my words. The hum went on for several minutes, steady, soothing, like a lullaby made of resonance instead of melody. I stayed still, afraid moving might break whatever fragile communion was unfolding. When it finally faded, the silence that followed was tender, soft, like someone pulling a blanket over sleeping shoulders. I exhaled shakily. "Okay," I whispered into the dim warmth. "We're really doing this, aren't we?" The leaves overhead glowed faint gold for a moment, then dimmed. I walked back to my quarters in a haze, the hum still reverberating through my bones. When I reached my bunk, I didn't bother undressing. I just lay down on top of the blanket, staring at the ceiling, feeling the echo of the greenhouse's nighttime song. My last thought before sleep claimed me was simple, strangely small. They know I'm here. Chapter 3. A Conversation with Leaves. I didn't realize how quickly silence settles in a place built for only one voice. By the third long cycle morning, I caught myself humming as I prepared nutrient solutions. Not because I particularly enjoy humming, but because the air felt too still without sound in it, as if the station itself needed noise to stay awake. My own footsteps had begun sounding foreign to me. Too sharp, too self-contained. The station's recycled atmosphere makes everything echo just a bit too long. The kind of acoustics that make a person feel like they're always being followed by an invisible version of themselves half a second behind. I was measuring out trace minerals when I heard it. The tiniest crackle, something like a paper-thin shell breaking open. I froze, hand still hovering over a measuring tray. The sound came again, soft but unmistakable. I turned slowly toward the cluster of plants I'd cataloged yesterday as harmless, vaguely alien-looking shrubs with cup-shaped leaves. One of the cups was slowly unfurling, unfolding petal by petal in a slow-motion yawn. The timing of it stopped me. 15 seconds earlier, I had muttered to myself, "God, I'm tired," without even thinking, in the way people murmur when nobody's listening. Except something might have been. I approached carefully, crouching beside the plant. "You're either incredibly sensitive to humidity changes," I whispered, "or that was very well timed." The plant didn't move again, of course, but its edges glimmered faintly, a translucence that hadn't been present yesterday. I logged the observation in my handheld recorder, listening to my own voice echo tinnily through the greenhouse like a stranger's. Possible delayed reaction to temperature shift? Or emotional stimulus? No, that's not scientific. I stopped recording, embarrassed at myself, even though there was no one around to hear. I resumed humming without meaning to. A scrappy, childish melody, half remembered from a lullaby my mother used to play on a tiny wind-up music box. As soon as the tune took shape, a cluster of bioluminescent vines along the far wall began to pulse faintly. Dim, bright, dim, bright, in a rhythm approximating the awkward beat of my humming. I froze again. The vines continued as if waiting for me to continue. When I stopped humming, their glow softened into a steady low light. "Okay," I said to no one. "That's definitely new." Not impossible. Vines respond to vibrations, especially on a moon with weak atmospheric buffering. But new. Let's test that. I pulled out my tablet and opened an audio generator app. The greenhouse seemed to hush, as if concentrating. I played a mid-range tone, soft and sustained. The vines rippled, glow intensifying by a shade. I shifted the tone higher, then lower. They responded to each change with what felt like deliberate choreography, leaning almost imperceptibly toward the speaker. I turned the sound off and exhaled. My breath trembled in a way that reminded me I hadn't spoken to a real human in over 60 hours. "What are you doing?" I asked them gently. "Are you reacting or listening?" The vines didn't answer, but a leaf beside my knee tilted, almost nudged, as if angling itself toward the question. A coincidence. Has to be. But I felt a small, involuntary laugh leave my chest. Not because it was funny, but because it was a relief to hear myself sound a little human again. Throughout the next few hours, I worked as if surrounded by colleagues, narrating to the plants the way I used to narrate student labs back on Earth. Not formal explanations, just idle commentary to fill the space. This nutrient mix is a little heavy on nitrogen, don't judge me. "You're growing too fast. Slow down, I can't keep up. If any of you have opinions on my hair today, please keep them to yourselves." It felt ridiculous, but less ridiculous than the silence. And the more I talked, the more the plants responded, though subtly and not always immediately. When I passed by the vine cluster again, a few tendrils leaned like they were curious, following my movement. When I accidentally dropped a tool and muttered a frustrated curse, several broad leaves in the arid section flattened as if shrinking away. Stress seemed to affect them. I tested it, poking lightly at a fragile moss while deliberately raising my voice. Its tiny fronds contracted, color darkening. When I softened my tone and apologized, the green returned. "Responsive photoreactivity influenced by emotional stimuli," I said into my log later, "or the illusion of such. Potential correlation between tonal warmth and pigment changes. More testing required." I paused, feeling heat rise to my cheeks even though no one would ever watch these logs in real time. And I'm talking to them, out loud, more than I should. I ended the recording quickly. Naming them happened by accident. I was trimming a spiraling vine, a deep violet one that had nearly strangled its neighbor overnight, when I muttered, "You're kind of a menace, aren't you?" The vine twitched slightly toward my voice. "Menace," I repeated, and it just stuck. A stupid name, but it made the whole experience feel less like I was losing the fragile boundary between scientific detachment and loneliness. The tiny moss in the arid section, the one that always wilted when I spoke too abruptly, became shy. The cupleaf shrub that yawned this morning became yawner. A fern-like cluster with shimmering fronds that seemed to breathe became echo. And the glowing vines were christened lumen strings, which wasn't a joke but felt right. The worst part was how natural it began to feel, as if I'd always worked this way. Speaking to plants, waiting for tiny signs of acknowledgement, reacting to reactions. It reminded me of talking to pets, or to babies who blinked and giggled without knowing why. Something in me softened in their presence, even the ones that looked vaguely predatory. The highlight of the day, or the long cycle segment that approximated late afternoon, came when I sat on one of the old benches the previous caretaker had carved names into. I rested my elbows on my knees, letting the warm, humid air settle around me. All at once, without any prompting, several of the lumen strings draped down from their support beam and formed a half circle around me, a soft constellation of pulsing light. "Are you keeping me company?" I whispered. The glow brightened at the sound of my voice, sinking into a slow, breathing rhythm. Warm-toned bioluminescence. Comforting. I felt it not only in my eyes but in my chest, like a quiet reassurance. Loneliness, I realized, was a signal they understood. I didn't record that part. Some things felt too intimate to memorialize in scientific logs. Instead, I rested there, surrounded by lights that swayed despite the lack of breeze, and let myself speak softly about nothing at all. About Earth, about long days and early mornings in the university greenhouse. About my brother who once hid frogs in my boots as a joke. About the first time I saw my name on a research grant approval. The plants didn't move dramatically, didn't offer grand answers, didn't perform tricks, but they stayed near. They existed around me with a gentleness that felt deliberate, an attentiveness that grew harder to dismiss as coincidence. By the time I returned to the maintenance room, exhausted but oddly warmed, I caught myself whispering, "Good night, strings." A subtle ripple ran along the vines, dimming slowly like a row of lanterns going out one by one. I knew, scientifically speaking, that light fluctuations can occur due to temperature shifts, internal chemical cycles, or residual energy discharge. But alone on a remote moon, with no voices but my own and no companions but leaves and tendrils and faintly glowing fronds, it was easy to imagine it as a reply. "And God help me," I whispered back. Chapter 4. The 80-hour day. The human body wasn't meant for a world where the sun rises only once every 80 hours. I knew this in theory, had read the research, sat through the orientation modules where a psychologist explained how to maintain a healthy circadian rhythm in extreme light cycles. But knowing it and living it are different things. Living it feels like slowly slipping out of time with yourself, like walking through a dream that refuses to let you wake fully. I tried to keep Earth hours at first. 8 hours of sleep, 16 awake, no exceptions. Alarms set on my tablet. Every cycle, every task measured in clean, human-shaped blocks. But Dawnbloom Station didn't care about my alarms. The greenhouse certainly didn't. It glowed with its artificial mimicry of Lumen 6's sky, bright and warm for more than 40 hours at a stretch. I'd wake from what was supposed to be night, only to find a blaze of full-spectrum light beating through the greenhouse windows, the plants stirring in endless midday. By the fourth long cycle, morning, I was already drifting. Not tired exactly, more like my brain had loosened its grip on linear thinking, thoughts folded into each other. I'd be pruning Menace's vines and suddenly remember the smell of my grandmother's kitchen, or the chilly mornings walking to class in Boston, the steam rising from sewer grates like ghosts. The memories arrived with a strange softness, warm around the edges, almost comforting, as if something inside me encouraged them. Maybe the oxygen level is running high, I told myself. Or maybe some species releases low-dose neurochemicals. Nothing dangerous, just the kind that make the mind wander. Perfectly plausible, perfectly scientific. Except the wandering didn't stop when I left the greenhouse. Even in my sleeping quarters, where the lights dimmed as they were supposed to, my thoughts felt buoyant. Loose. I'd start a sentence in my log and realize halfway through that I was drifting into recollection rather than observation. In the shower, I'd catch myself humming again. Different tunes each time, ones I hadn't consciously thought about in years. The plants responded differently depending on the light phase. During the full bright hours, the larger species opened themselves wide, leaves spread like wings, absorbing. They seemed sharper, more alert. Menace craned toward me more actively during the bright period, vines arching high enough that I had to gently push them back. But during the long, dim shift, the time when the artificial lights dipped into a cool dusk, they changed, softened. The lumen strings dimmed to warm pulses that reminded me of breathing. The cupleaf shrubs closed protectively. Even Echo, the fern clusters, settled into a slow, rhythmic sway. I charted these changes as any botanist would, but somewhere in my mind I felt a tug, as though the plants weren't just reacting to the environment. They were waiting for something, expecting. Oh, the first noticeable sign of my sleep slipping came on what should have been my third night. I lay in my bunk trying to force my eyes closed, but the bright phase glow leaking down the corridor made my brain insist it was noon, not midnight. I turned over again and again, the sheets sticking to my skin in the recycled humidity. I sat up and whispered into the dim, "This is ridiculous." A soft sound answered me. Not outside the door, but inside my mind. The memory of a leaf's faint crackle, the sound a vine makes when disturbed, the way Shy's tiny fronds shiver when I speak too loudly. It wasn't real, of course, just leftover impressions from spending too much time in the greenhouse. I pressed my palms to my eyes. "I'm not losing it," I told myself, but the whisper sounded fragile. Eventually, I gave up and returned to the greenhouse. The second the door slid open, I felt a wash of warmth on my skin, like stepping into a familiar room after too long away. The lumen strings brightened just a fraction, but enough to notice. A tendril from Menace curled toward me at ankle height. "It isn't nighttime for you, is it?" I murmured. A sound somewhere between a ripple and a sigh moved through the foliage, though no ventilation fan was active. I ignored the twist in my chest. I wandered through the aisles, letting myself drift. Maybe this wasn't the healthiest coping mechanism, but it felt better than lying awake with buzzing thoughts. The plants in the dim phase seemed to glow faintly, almost imperceptibly as I passed. Bioluminescence responding to motion, I told myself. Thermal contrast, perfectly explainable. I reached Echo and brushed the fronds with my fingertips. They shivered, but gently, like greeting me instead of recoiling. "This isn't sustainable," I whispered. "I can't stay awake for 40 hours at a time." Several leaves shifted, subtle but synchronized. "I need to sleep," I continued, forcing the words out like a confession. "If I don't sleep, I start losing track of—" I cut myself off as a wave of dizziness swept through me. Not the dangerous kind, more like the sensation of stepping into a dream before you're ready. I steadied myself against the bench. Maybe the air mix was off. Maybe I'd forgotten to recalibrate the oxygen scrubbers. But when I checked later, the readings were normal, perfectly in spec. No CO2 spikes, no O2 surplus. So why did I feel like the greenhouse was breathing with me? By what I estimated to be hour 30 of the bright phase, the plants grew restless. Bloom patterns shifted. A species near the arid section, which I hadn't cataloged yet, unfurled elongated petals that flickered with bioluminescent veins like tiny constellations. They weren't open yesterday, or if they had been, they hadn't pulsed. "I'm losing my sense of time," I said aloud. The leaves rustled again, a soft chorus. I wanted to laugh or cry or both. "Don't sympathize," I told them. "It's not helping." But the warmth in the air felt like sympathy all the same. Later, much later, I recorded a log. My voice sounded worn and airy, tinged with something I couldn't entirely identify. Day 4, or 5, hard to tell. I'm attempting to maintain an Earth-like schedule, but Dawn Bloom's cycle is overriding all of it. Plants exhibit clear phase-dependent behavior. Some species bloom exclusively during dim hours. Others appear more responsive during bright phase. The level of synchrony between the plant activity and my own circadian slipping is notable. I hesitated before adding, "I think they're learning me." The words escaped before I could filter them. Once spoken, they hung in the air like a fragile truth. I ended the recording too quickly, heart thumping. I didn't want to think about the possibility that they were learning me, not just reacting to environmental cues. I didn't want to admit the obvious, that the longer I stayed in the greenhouse, the more my internal rhythms aligned with those plants rather than with Earth logic. I tried returning to my quarters again that night, or what I insisted was night. But the moment I stepped out of the greenhouse, the air felt thinner, colder. My eyelids twitched. A lingering hum seemed to follow me into the hall, soft but insistent. I shut my door behind me and pressed my back to it. "You're imagining things," I whispered. But then the lights flickered, just once. So faintly I almost convinced myself it was nothing, like the station itself exhaled. There were no drafts, no wind, no reason for the vines I'd left behind to sway. And yet, in my mind, I could see them, reaching, waiting, responding. I fell asleep eventually, but when I woke, whenever that was, I felt like I was waking into someone else's rhythm, as if time belonged more to the greenhouse than to me. And as much as I tried to deny it, I didn't feel entirely alone anymore. Chapter 5. Ghosts of the caretakers before me. Amy woke before the lights rose. For a moment, she lay still in the dark of her sleeping quarters, listening to the faint hum that always lingered through Don Bloom Station's walls. Most people would have mistaken it for the soft churn of air recyclers or the distant buzz of the greenhouse's thermal pumps. But she had spent enough hours awake at odd intervals, long days, longer nights, to recognize it now as something else. A resonance. A pulse that drifted through the habitat not like machinery, but like a memory. She pushed herself upright, rubbing her eyes. Lumen 6's strange day cycle had already stretched her sense of time into something thin and wavering. She'd gotten maybe 2 hours of sleep. Or 10. The station didn't care. The moon didn't care. The plants definitely didn't care. The air felt charged when she stepped out into the corridor, cooler than usual, tinged with the faint metallic taste that meant the greenhouse vents were circulating into the living wing. Odd. The vents shouldn't be open this early. Or maybe they had been open all night. Time blurred here. Patterns overlapped. Amy touched the side panel, checking the environmental logs. A blank screen greeted her. That wasn't right. The panel flickered, then booted up slower than usual, displaying a list of recent adjustments made automatically by the station's caretaker AI. Humidity fluctuations, oxygen surges, spore filtration cycles increasing without a scheduled reason. Nothing alarming, technically, just inconsistent. But she had learned something important in her first days at Don Bloom Station. The systems only acted strange when the greenhouse was acting stranger. She tucked that thought away and headed down the corridor. The greenhouse entrance loomed ahead, its reinforced door framed with the same pale green glow the vines emitted during their hum hours. Morning, station morning, hadn't started yet, but the plants were already awake. She could feel that wakefulness like a ripple against her skin. "Good morning," she whispered out of habit. Faint rustling answered her from the other side. She wasn't surprised. But today, as she approached the greenhouse, she hesitated before entering. Instead of heading straight inside to greet the rows of vines and whispering leaves, she turned right toward the secondary lab, the archival room she had been putting off exploring. It was time. She needed answers about the caretaker before her. Dr. Halden, the man whose name appeared in half the maintenance logs, whose handwriting still lingered in old labels, whose broken audio files had been sitting in the database like warning signs too faded to interpret, and whose last days at Don Bloom Station had left almost no reliable data behind. Amy keyed the door open. The lock clicked louder than she expected, like it was relieved to be used again. The archival room smelled of old dust and sterilized plastic. The overhead lights flickered once before settling into a steady glow. The shelves held rows upon rows of data rods, thin tablets, sealed containers with samples long petrified. Most were labeled with meticulous detail. Others were streaked with faded writing or smudged beyond recognition. She felt suddenly out of place, an intruder in someone else's abandoned kingdom. The workstation hummed to life when she touched it. A login prompt. She entered her credentials, then navigated to the caretaker logs. The system displayed a tidy list of names. Except one. A large portion of entries under Dr. Renard Halden's ID were corrupted. Not missing. Corrupted. Fragmented like shattered glass. Amy frowned and opened the earliest intact file. A video popped up, timestamped 32 months ago. Dr. Halden appeared on screen, a man in his mid-40s with tired, intelligent eyes and a beard he probably trimmed himself. His uniform was wrinkled. A vine hung in the background. Not unusual, except it creeped along the wall behind him at a slow, deliberate pace she didn't believe was possible until she saw it slide behind his shoulder. Day 65, Halden said. His voice sounded dry, stretched thin. The new seeds have taken to hydroponics faster than predicted. The hybrids in Section B seem more active during the mid-dim cycle, possibly reacting to my presence. Possibly coincidence. He paused, glancing over his shoulder, not fearfully, but with an odd tenderness. Hard to tell yet. Observation continues. The log ended. Amy opened the next one, a few days later. This time, Halden spoke faster, distracted. Section C's humidity changes every time I leave. He's muttered. Levels rise when I enter. I've confirmed it 3 times. The sensors aren't malfunctioning. They can't be. It's responding, but I don't know to what. In the background, soft rustling echoed behind him. He didn't react to it. Amy felt her throat tighten. The next log loaded automatically. Halden looked more disheveled now, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. His voice trembled with a strange blend of frustration and awe. They're learning, he whispered. Lunaris 9, the species we thought was catatonic. It curls when I raise my voice. It unfurls when I whisper. It blooms when I'm calm. It withers when I'm anxious. It's not reacting to the environment. It's reacting to me. His hand lifted, trembling slightly. It's beautiful. The file glitched. Static swallowed half the image, leaving only fragments of Halden's face, the outline of vines creeping closer behind him, and the faintest sound that could have been wind. Or whispering. Amy swallowed hard. She opened the next file. Corrupted. The one after. Corrupted. The 20th file flickered, then showed only half a second. A vine in the lab moving too quickly, a blur of bioluminescence. Dozens more files refused to load entirely. Her pulse quickened as she scrolled through the list. Almost every log from Halden's final month was unreadable. Only the audio files remained, and even those were damaged. She clicked one at random. Static. A low hum. Then, not unstable. I understand. Pattern. There is a pattern. Another glitch. A sharp intake of breath. Following me. No, not following. Anticipating. Click. Silence. Amy opened another. Shouldn't bloom in this phase, but it did, because I... Static swallowed the rest. Another file. They're awake even when I'm asleep. I feel them watching the door. Another. I'm not alone in here. Her breath caught. One more file remained unplayed. Its name wasn't a timestamp. It was a single word. Don't. She clicked it without hesitation. The audio began with quiet breathing. Not frantic, just slow. Controlled. Halden's voice came softly, as if he were speaking inches from the mic. If you're listening to this, you feel it too. Amy froze. You think it's your imagination. It isn't. They adapt faster than any model predicts. They respond to emotion. To thoughts, maybe. I don't know. I didn't have enough time. A faint rustle in the background. His breath hitched. I made a mistake. I got too close. I let them depend on me. The rustling grew louder. And now they don't want me to leave. Static burst across the audio. Something heavy hit the floor. A strained exhale. Then Halden spoke again, but his voice was weaker. Don't let them learn you too quickly. Don't let them... A sharp crack. Then silence. Amy sat motionless for a long time, her heart pounding ahead of her thoughts. She didn't want to believe what she'd heard. Halden could have been sleep-deprived. He could have been hallucinating. Isolation did terrible things to the mind. But the audio hadn't sounded like someone lost in their imagination. It sounded like someone telling the truth too late. She leaned back in the chair, staring at the rows of corrupted files. A chill crept along her shoulders. She felt the strange urge to look over her own shoulder, the same way Halden had during his earliest logs. She resisted, barely. She exhaled and stood up. The room felt smaller now, the shelves taller, the walls closer. She needed air. She needed distance from Halden's voice lingering in her ears. But when she stepped into the corridor, she paused. A vine, thin, glowing softly, lay across the floor, stretched gently toward her door. She hadn't heard it move. She hadn't seen it earlier. Her breath caught. The vine wasn't twisting or climbing, it wasn't invasive. It simply rested there, as if waiting for her. She stepped past it carefully, not touching it. The vine curled slightly, like a cat twitching an ear in her direction. Not now, she whispered, softer than she meant to. It stilled. The greenhouse door was only a few steps away, its faint glow pulsing in a slow rhythm, like breath, like heartbeat, like invitation. Amy reached out, placing her palm on the door panel. Before opening it, she whispered, quietly, instinctively, "I'm not going anywhere." Something rustled inside. Leaves brushing, roots shifting, a soft ripple of motion responding to her voice. Her hand trembled on the door. Dr. Halden had said he wasn't alone in here. Amy realized with a rising shiver that she wasn't either. Not anymore. And maybe, she thought, she never had been. Chapter 6. Growth Patterns I Cannot Explain. I didn't sleep after reviewing Dr. Halden's logs. I tried. I lay down in my narrow bunk, palms pressed to my eyes, and telling myself that exhaustion was the only reason I felt such an electric awareness in the greenhouse, like the air itself had leaned closer. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard Halden's voice whispering between the radio static. They respond to emotion. Don't let them learn you too quickly. I shouldn't have listened to it before bed. I knew that. But the station had a way of dissolving boundaries between good choices and inevitable ones. So instead of sleeping, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the distant hum of the greenhouse breathing through the ventilation ducts. At some point, minutes or hours later, I gave up, rolled out of bed, and padded barefoot down the corridor. The greenhouse lights were still in their dim phase, casting a soft silver luminance along the metal floor. Even before I touched the door, I could feel the pressure change, like the plants recognized me through the sealed barrier. "Morning," I murmured. The lights inside brightened by a fraction. I stepped in. The air welcomed me like a warm exhale. Dew clung to the broad leaves of the lumen fronds. Tiny beads of bioluminescent sap glowed like constellations suspended in green. For a moment, everything seemed peaceful, familiar. But I felt, or maybe sensed, that something had shifted overnight. The vines near the central hydrobeds had gathered tighter than yesterday. The Lunaris 9 blossoms had repositioned themselves to face the walkway, petals tilted in what could have been coincidence. Except I no longer believed in coincidence here. I slid the greenhouse door fully open and walked inside, letting it close behind me with its usual soft seal. As it latched, a faint rustle rippled through the nearest cluster of fronds. They were reacting, not to temperature, not to airflow. To me. Last night's files still played across my thoughts, but I pushed them away. I needed data, not fear. If Halden had been right, then observation had to come before interpretation. I wasn't here to be afraid. I was here to learn. "All right," I whispered, pulling my hair into a loose tie. "Let's see what you're really capable of." I started with the basics, monitoring humidity, soil chemistry, nutrient cycling. Everything looked normal, or as normal as it could be in this strange, evolving ecosystem. The greenhouse's environmental systems were stable, even with the faint, inexplicable variations I was getting used to. It was the plants themselves that troubled me. Their positions had shifted. Not a little. Significantly. Yesterday, I had placed small colored markers along the edges of the helix vines to measure overnight growth. Nothing unusual. Vines grow fast, and helix species on Lumen 6 were known for their rapid phototropic reactions. But when I measured the distance now, my breath caught. The nearest vine had moved a full 2 meters. Not grown. Moved. Its base remained planted, thick roots burrowed into the soil bed, but the vine itself had reoriented across the walkway like a creature stretching in sleep. I crouched, fingertips hovering above its surface. The faint glow pulsed beneath the translucent membrane, slow and rhythmic. "Is that even physically possible?" I whispered. The vine stirred just slightly, enough to make me pull my hand back. I swallowed, the cold spike of fear tempered by a botanist's fascination. Growth that rapid should require enormous energy expenditure. Chemical gradients, cell division, structural reinforcement. But these vines didn't seem stressed. They didn't look torn or hastily remodeled. They simply looked comfortable. Okay, I murmured. We need controlled tests. If Halden had been testing vocal tone and emotional stimuli, as his log suggested, then I needed to replicate that. Data, Amy. Always data first. I began with the simplest variable, emotion. I set up my handheld recorder, stabilizing it on a crate of soil supplements. A few lunaris blossoms nearby tilted toward it like curious pets. Test 31, I said softly. Emotional provocation. Variables, elevated stress response, calm tone, neutral phrasing. I chose a cluster of vines that had shown responsiveness before. Their leaves shimmered faintly when I approached. All right, I whispered. Let's just try something mild. I inhaled sharply, summoning the memory of Halden's audio log, the moment the crash sounded, letting that spike of unease rise in my chest. My heartbeat quickened. Instantly, the vines recoiled. Not violently, but unmistakably, their bioluminescence dimmed, the fronds folding inward like a flinch. I exhaled, forcing myself to calm. Their leaves unfolded again. This wasn't phototropism. This wasn't sound wave sensitivity. This was something else. They were responding to the physiological markers of emotion. Heart rate, breathing patterns, microtension in my posture. I checked my wrist monitor. Heart rate spike of 19 BPM. Okay, I said softly, attempting to steady my voice. Let's try vocal tone next. The vines angled toward me, light brightening slightly. I spoke again, this time low and gentle. You're all right. I'm not here to hurt you. The vines responded immediately. The light along their stems brightened, spreading across them like a slow-moving wave. I switched deliberately to a louder, firmer tone, projecting like I would in a classroom. Move aside, please. The vines nearest me twisted away. Not fast, but coordinated. I stared, mouth falling open. That reaction wasn't defensive. It wasn't frightened. It was obedient. Or maybe simply receptive. Okay, I breathed. Okay. I rubbed my forehead, half laughing in disbelief. I shouldn't anthropomorphize. I knew better. But it was getting harder not to. If any of my colleagues back on Earth could see this, they'd accuse me of falsifying data or having a mental breakdown. Plants don't just listen to you. They don't parse tone. But these were not Earth plants. I resumed the test. A neutral tone produced minimal movement. A soothing tone produced growth. Actual growth. Buds swelling visibly over the course of seconds. A harsh tone produced shrinkage. I ran the experiment again. Identical results. My hands trembled as I typed notes into my datapad. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't hallucinating. The plants were responding in predictable, measurable ways. I set my pad down and leaned against one of the support rails, letting myself breathe. My heart was still racing, too fast, adrenaline humming in my fingertips. I glanced over at the lunaris blossoms. The moment I noticed my pulse, so did they. They budded, rapidly, faster than any flower I had ever seen. The petals unfolded in a time-lapse blur, revealing brilliant sapphire cores that pulsed in perfect sync with my heartbeat. I pressed my hand to my chest. No way, I whispered. The flowers pulsed again, in rhythm. A laugh broke out of me, thin, nervous, disbelieving. You're kidding. You're actually reading my... The vines rustled without wind. The sound wasn't random movement. It wasn't the soft chafing of leaves against one another. It was a ripple, coordinated. A single wave of motion passing through a dozen different species like a shared breath. Something in the pit of my stomach twisted. I needed to distance myself, just for a moment, to think scientifically again. I grabbed my mapping device and moved to the far edge of the greenhouse, to the small experimental section where I had marked the growth of the spiraling flare vine species. Yesterday, I had placed a series of colored rings around its position. Today, none of them aligned. Not one. The vine had moved further overnight than any natural biological process could explain without tearing itself apart. Impossible, I whispered. I followed its trail, gently pushing leaves aside, and saw something that made me drop to a crouch. The roots. They had spread out in patterns that looked almost mathematical. Not radial, not chaotic. Fractal. Branching structures like complex neural maps, like the diagrams we use to model brain activity or fungal information transfer networks. But this wasn't random resemblance. It was too exact. My breath slowed to a stop. This is intentional, I said aloud. Saying it made it real. Was it possible? Maybe. Some terrestrial species already showed rudimentary electrical communication. Mycorrhizal fungal networks could transmit resource data, stress signals, even warnings of predators. Plants could talk in a manner of speaking. But this was too organized, too efficient. If the greenhouse species had adapted to Lumen 6's long day cycle, its magnetic fields, its mineral-rich substrate, then maybe evolution had pushed them further than any Earth model predicted. Maybe the plants here were capable of distributing information the way a brain does, or a hive. I set the mapping device down, my hands shaking. "What are you learning from me?" I whispered. The leaves rustled. No wind. No ventilation cycle. Just rustling. A shiver traveled down my arms. I backed up slowly, but the flare vine didn't move toward me. It didn't advance or follow. It simply settled, its glow softening like a dimming heartbeat. I spent the next several hours replicating tests, vocal tone, emotional shifts, visual markers. The results never varied. Not even once. Every plant species in Dawnbloom Station responded to me with alarming consistency. When I whispered, they grew. When I calmed myself, they brightened, uncoiled, reached upward. When I panicked, they recoiled like frightened animals. It was undeniable now. There was a relationship here. Symbiotic, responsive, maybe even adaptive. I felt a strange exhilaration as I documented every reaction, a heat bubbling beneath my skin. Discovery. Horror disguised as wonder. By midday, whatever midday meant in an 80-hour day, I decided to regroup at the central walkway. I set my datapad down and tried to steady myself. My head throbs lightly from hours of concentration. I didn't speak for a long time. I simply breathed. The plants breathed with me. That realization came slowly, sinking in like ink through water. Hours ago, I might have questioned whether it was imagination. But imagination couldn't alter growth rates. Imagination couldn't produce measurable physiological responses. Imagination couldn't make vines tilt toward me like sunflowers tracking the sun. I sat down, legs folding beneath me. A lunaris blossom leaned closer, brushing my arm with a softness that startled me. Not aggressive, not invasive. Just present. "Are you copying me?" I whispered. The petals brightened. My heart pounded. A dozen more blossoms bloomed suddenly in a ring around me. Bloomed. I covered my mouth with one hand. "You're not supposed to be able to do that." Something rustled behind me. A long, sliding sound, familiar yet newly unsettling. When I turned, I saw that a grouping of vines had repositioned themselves, not toward the lights, not toward the nearest nutrient reservoir, but toward me. I felt warmth rise along my throat. "Okay," I said shakily. "That's enough for today." The lights dimmed by a fraction. My pulse spiked. The lights brightened again. I laughed under my breath. That's not funny. But it was, in a way that made my skin prickle. The greenhouse wasn't just reacting. It was attuning, adjusting its environment to accommodate me. Like it needed me. Or wanted me. I stood and moved toward the exit, stepping carefully around the newly budded blossoms. As I passed the tree-like pulseferna in the corner, its leaves unfurled wider, brushing the air like an exhale. When I reached the door, I paused. "I'll be back soon," I said softly, without meaning to. The greenhouse rustled in a slow, spreading wave. I stepped backward, startled. The plants had never responded so collectively before. It felt like acknowledgement. I placed my hand on the door panel. A lunarous blossom near the center of the greenhouse bloomed one last time, an echo of light. I opened the door, stepping through before the thought could settle too deeply in my mind. As the seal closed behind me, I realized something chillingly, undeniably true. The plants had not only learned me, they were still learning. And they were learning faster than I could understand. Chapter 7. The first sign of need, Dawnbloom Station had always made its requests in quiet ways. A flicker of a lantern where no wind touched it. A door that drifted open with the unhurried certainty of a yawn. A hum in the rails that felt more like a shiver under the skin than anything mechanical. But on the morning the first true sign of need appeared, the entire station felt different. Subtly, but undeniably, as if some invisible hand had nudged the world a few degrees off its axis. I woke before sunrise, which was unusual. Dawnbloom's nights tended to wrap me so gently that I often slept deeper here than anywhere else. But something tugged at me. Not urgent, not frightening, just insistent, like a child shaking someone awake because they were scared of something they couldn't name. When I sat up, the room felt colder than it should have been. My breath didn't frost in the air, but it felt like it could. The light from the glass pane window had a faint blue tint, even though dawn wasn't far. I swung my feet onto the cool floorboards, rubbing sleep from my eyes. Sova, who usually waited by the door for breakfast, was nowhere in sight. Her absence prickled like static. She never missed mornings. The kettle in the kitchen whined the moment I stepped onto the bottom stair. That was the first real sign that something was off. Dawnbloom sometimes helped with tasks, a floating teacup here, a door held open there, but it had never started the kettle on its own. I lifted the warm metal off the stove, shutting it off before it could scream. The scent of heat and steam curled upward, leaving wisps of something floral I couldn't place. As I poured hot water over tea leaves, a soft creak echoed through the hall. Not a normal creak. Every station caretaker could tell the difference. This one was hesitant, like a footstep made by someone who wasn't sure they deserved to take up space. I followed the sound to the main corridor, past the maps, past the empty ticket booth, past the coat rack where no coats ever stayed for long unless I forced them to. The creak came again, a little louder. It led me toward the maintenance wing. I hesitated. That part of the station was the oldest, and even after all the days I'd spent here, I hadn't explored much of it. The iron beams were rusted in places, the walls bowed with the weight of too many winters, and the air always smelled faintly of minerals and old paper. The last caretaker had left a note about avoiding certain doors. He never spelled out why. Even after everything I'd seen since arriving, I still honored his cautions. But Dawnbloom wanted something. I could feel it now, humming faintly in my ribs, the same way it hummed in the rails when a train was approaching. Or wanting to approach. I tightened my grip on the mug and moved forward. Every step stirred dust that danced in the slanted blue light. As I walked deeper into the wing, the air grew warmer, as if the station's pulse beat closer to the surface here. The corridor narrowed until I reached a door I'd never noticed before, one that blended almost too perfectly into the wall. Weathered, unassuming, but the wood was warmer under my fingertips than the surrounding paneling. Something shifted behind it. "Sova?" I asked quietly, even though I knew she wouldn't hide herself away up like this. No answer. I pushed the door open. A wave of warm air brushed past me like an exhale. The room beyond was small, barely more than a storage nook, filled with stacks of crates and old burlap sacks that smelled faintly of dried lavender. A window high near the ceiling cast soft light down like a spotlight over the floor. That's when I saw it. A single leaf. Just one. A deep gold color, curled at the edges, lying in the exact center of the room. Not strange on its own, except that Dawnbloom had no trees inside. No rot, no overgrowth. Leaves didn't simply wander into sealed maintenance rooms, especially not ones that looked as though they'd recently fallen from a tree that didn't exist. My pulse quickened as I crouched down, fingertips hovering just above it. The leaf trembled. Only slightly, like it was caught in a breeze I couldn't feel, but I felt the shift in the air at the same moment, like the station inhaled sharply. "Okay," I whispered, holding still. "You've got my attention." The leaf lifted off the ground. Slowly, gracefully. It was as if invisible hands were raising it with utmost care. It spun once, hovering a foot above the floor, and drifted closer to me. As it rotated, the golden surface brightened, not glowing exactly, but holding the light in a strange way, as though dawn had crawled inside the veins of the leaf and made a home there. Then it dropped, softly, directly against my palm. A warmth spread up my arm. Not heat, warmth, like stepping into a room where someone had been waiting just for you. And beneath that warmth came something else, something deeper. A message. Not words, but intention, shaped like a plea. Dawn Bloom needed me. Badly. The leaf crumbled into ash even though I hadn't crushed it. It dissolved into a fine, glittering dust, drifting like sparks from a fire until it vanished entirely. "All right," I murmured. "What happened? What are you trying to show me?" A tremor ran through the floor. Just one. Short, sharp, unmistakable. I shot upright, heart climbing into my throat. Dawn Bloom had never shuddered like that. I hurried back into the corridor, listening for more. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the lanterns flickered once. Twice, 3 times in rapid succession. A pattern. Not random. The same rhythm as the rails when a train passed through. Only there was no train scheduled today. "Sova," I called again, louder this time. "Where are you?" I heard a soft trill from the station garden. Relief washed through me like someone had poured warm tea straight into my bones. I hurried toward her voice, my steps quick but careful. When I reached the garden, the sight stopped me. Sova stood near the center of the flowers, feathers puffed, wings half flared in a defensive posture I'd never seen on her before. Her luminous eyes fixed on something lodged between gaps in the old stone walkway. A root. Just one. Thin, blackened, and twitching slightly as though trying to pull itself deeper into the earth. I approached slowly, aware of Sova's rigid stance. "What is that?" I whispered, though the question was pointless. She didn't know any better than I did. The root jerked. Sova hissed, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the garden's usual calm. I knelt a foot away, studying the thing. The stones beneath it were cracked, more than they had been yesterday, as if something had pushed up from below. Something wrong. The earth around the root looked pale, nearly drained of its color. Grass near it had yellowed in a perfect circle. Even the sunlight filtering through the glass ceiling seemed weaker here, as though something hungry was pulling every bit of warmth and light toward itself. I reached out a hand, but before I could touch the stone, the root retreated, a quick snap backward like a startled animal disappearing into a hole. The ground shuddered again. Not enough to throw me off balance, but enough to confirm it wasn't an accident. Something was beneath Dawn Bloom. Something alive. Something the station feared. For a long moment, I simply knelt there, staring at the cracked stones, feeling the pulse of the station pushing faintly against my palms. Dawn Bloom didn't want this here. It wanted me to understand, to respond, to act. And that scared me more than the trembling earth. "What do you need me to do?" I whispered. The wind didn't answer. The rails didn't hum. But the flowers nearest the cracked stones bent toward me ever so slightly, their petals trembling like hands reaching out, not for help, but for reassurance. Whatever was happening, I wasn't imagining it. Dawn Bloom Station, whatever form its awareness took, was asking, begging for attention. A sudden clang echoed through the hallways, sharp enough to jolt both Sova and me upright. It came from the direction of the storage depot. A second clang followed, louder, metallic, like something had struck one of the old steel lockers. Sova launched herself onto my shoulder, talons gripping tight. I stood. "All right," I whispered, voice steadier than I felt. "Let's see what the station is trying to show us next." And as I stepped out of the garden, another leaf, this one green, small, trembling, floated down from nowhere and landed gently at my feet. Dawn Bloom was afraid. And that meant the real trouble was only beginning. Chapter 8. The Greenhouse Dreams with Me. The greenhouse had always breathed differently from the rest of Dawn Bloom Station. Even on quiet afternoons, it held a pulse of its own, steady and soft, like the lingering heartbeat of something ancient resting beneath glass and soil. I'd grown used to its rhythms, the faint rustle of vines even when there was no breeze, the gentle tapping of dewdrops against leaves, the heavy perfume of flowers that never wilted no matter the season. But that morning, when I stepped inside after the root had vanished beneath the stones and the echoes of the metallic clang still rang faintly in my ears, the greenhouse exhaled in a way I had never felt before. It wasn't just breathing. It was dreaming. The air felt thicker, nearly velvety against my skin, and the moment I crossed the threshold, a soft green haze drifted through the rafters overhead. It wasn't fog, and it wasn't smoke. It shimmered lightly, like pollen caught in a ray of sunlight, but it moved as though it had intention. Sova remained perched on my shoulder, feathers rigid, her tail curling against the side of my neck as if anchoring herself to me. Usually, she hopped down the moment we entered the greenhouse. Today, she refused to move. I shut the door gently behind me. The sound echoed too long, as if the glass panes were absorbing it and holding onto it. Light through the high windows fell in strange arcs, bending slightly, as though refracted by some invisible current drifting through the space. I know, I murmured to Sova. I feel it too. A cluster of dawn petals near the far benches shimmered in response. Not their usual soft glow. These brightened like a breath catching, a flicker of awareness acknowledging my presence. The petals flexed and their stems leaned toward me. All around the greenhouse, flowers shifted. The sound was subtle, like fabric brushing together, but unmistakable. They weren't turning to the sun. They were turning to me. The hairs on my arms lifted. Dawn Bloom Station had always been alive, but this was different. This was the station reaching out with intention, not instinct. I took a careful step forward. The moment my boot touched the stone walkway, vines overhead rustled like something waking suddenly. A row of small hanging blossoms swayed gently, though no breeze stirred the leaves. Their fragrance deepened, thickening the air. I tasted sweetness on my tongue, though I hadn't opened my mouth. "This is new," I whispered. Sova pressed her head beneath my chin. The further I walked, the warmer the greenhouse became, humidity wrapping around me like a second skin. The plants closest to the walkway bowed slightly, as if guiding me toward something. I wasn't sure where, only that the path they wanted me to follow seemed obvious, as though the very floor pulled me forward. I passed the section where the twilight orchids grew. Their petals were closed still, though it was late enough they should have begun their slow morning unfurling. But instead of opening, they pulsed faintly, as if holding their breath. One leaned over the path as I neared, nudging lightly at my sleeve before retreating again. "I don't know what you're trying to show me," I murmured, "but I'm listening." The orchids brightened briefly, as if in thanks. I approached the center of the greenhouse where the ancient heartvine grew. It was older than the station, or so said the caretaker notes. A thick braid of dark green stems wound around an enormous pillar, coiling upward toward the glass ceiling. At the base, its roots formed an intricate pattern in the soil, like intertwined fingers reaching outward. Usually, the heartvine slept quietly, blooming only at night in slow moonlit cycles. But now its leaves fluttered restlessly, as though something whispered to them from far below the earth. I stopped a few feet away. The heartvine stopped moving. The air stopped moving. Even Sova held her breath. Then the ground around the roots shifted. Not lightly, not subtly. The soil rose, lifting in a soft swell, then settled again. Leaves rustled along the heartvine's length. A soft hum vibrated from the pillar, low, almost musical, but carried a tremor of unease that crawled beneath my skin. When the heartvine moved again, it wasn't random. It reached toward me. I stepped back automatically, pulse leaping. A long tendril slithered across the soil like a hesitant hand, creeping closer until it touched the toe of my boot. It didn't grip. It didn't wrap. It simply rested there, trembling faintly. The moment it made contact, something flooded my mind. Not words. Not pictures. A feeling. Need. Deep and urgent. A plea so old it hurt. The heartvine wanted to show me something. Not here, not exactly. It needed me to see the place where the station had been wounded. Not physically, but somewhere beneath the layers of steel and stone and memory. Somewhere deep enough that I couldn't reach it by walking. But the greenhouse could. Because the greenhouse was dreaming. A soft ripple passed through the leaves overhead, a shimmer that swept across the rafters like a wind made of color. The petals of every flower glowed stronger for a breath, then faded in unison. The air thickened again, dizzying and warm. My vision blurred at the edges. No, wait. Too late. The tendril touching my boot pulsed. The greenhouse sighed around me. Then the world shifted. Not violently. No tearing sensation, no lurch of the stomach. Just a soft slipping, like falling asleep without realizing it. The stone walkway blurred into shades of green. The glass ceiling melted into soft white haze. Sova clung tighter, but her presence felt suddenly distant, as if she were perched on my shoulder from very far away. The plants around me dissolved, not fading but transforming, losing shape and regaining it in new forms. Leaves became waves of light. Flowers became drifting motes like fireflies caught in slow motion. The floor beneath me warmed until it felt like soft moss instead of stone. I blinked. The greenhouse was gone. Or, no, the greenhouse had changed. I stood in the same shape of the place, but not the same world. The rafters were now deep boughs of ancient trees arching overhead. The stone path was now a ribbon of glowing moss winding forward through a forest that couldn't possibly exist within the walls of Dawnbloom Station. Yet I recognized the heartbeat of the place. This was the greenhouse's dream. Sova stepped onto my shoulder again, her form flickering faintly like a reflection in water. She seemed as uncertain as I was, but she stayed pressed against my neck, grounding me. The dream forest shimmered faintly, as though only half committed to staying solid. Leaves glowed faint green, and vines hung like threads of woven light. The air was thicker here, every breath sweet but strange. I felt as though I was breathing memory rather than air. A soft chime echoed through the dream. I followed the moss path. The forest shifted with each step, not moving physically, but altering, as though showing different versions of itself layered over one another. One moment the trees were slender and pale, the next wide and ancient. Sometimes flowers bloomed at my feet, and other times roots curled across the path like reaching hands. The dream wanted me to see something, but it wasn't choosing a single form to show it in. It was showing me its whole history at once. After what felt like several minutes, though time didn't behave normally here, I reached a clearing and froze. At the center lay a great fracture in the earth. Not a hole, not a crack, a wound, glowing with a deep, sickly green light. Roots, dream roots, flickering like lines of memory, pulsed around the edges of the wound. Some pulled back from it, trembling. Others reached toward it, then curled away as if burned. This was what Dawnbloom feared. The wound pulsed again, sending a ripple through the clearing. Something stirred deep within it. A shape. Or perhaps just a movement. I stepped closer cautiously. The moss dimmed under my boots, wary. Sova chirped a warning, but I kept going. The dream had brought me here for a reason. I couldn't turn away now. When I knelt at the edge, warmth brushed my face. Then a soft voice. Not human, not words, but something ancient, rose from the wound. Help. The plea hit me hard enough to knock me backward, not physically, but inside. The sound wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was memory turning into sensation, desperation woven into feeling, fear wrapped in roots and time. Help. Something reached upward from the wound, but not a hand, not a creature. A strand of green light. A root of pure memory. It touched my knee. The dream shattered. Not violently, not painfully, just ended. The greenhouse snapped back into place like a held breath released. I gasped, blinking against sudden brightness. The heartvine's tendril still rested against my boot, trembling. The flowers around me shook lightly, petals fluttering as though they'd been holding their breath with me. Sova flared her wings but remained perched. The dream was gone, but the wound I had seen burned in my mind, vivid and impossible to ignore. I pressed a hand to the heartvine gently. I saw it, I whispered. I understand. The vine curled closer, relieved. I didn't know what was beneath Dawnbloom Station, but I knew this much now. It was alive. It was hurting. And whatever it was, it needed me. Chapter 9. The Collapse of Routine. The morning after the dream didn't feel like a morning at all. Lumen 6's light crept through the greenhouse windows in its slow 80-hour arc, painting long gold streaks on the floorboards, but none of it felt real. My internal clock, already frayed from the extended day cycle, felt like it had finally given up. I woke after what should have been 6 or 7 hours and found that nearly 20 had passed. My forehead still carried the faint imprint of the bench cushion where I'd fallen asleep. Sova perched on the lamp beside my bed, feathers puffed up in a neat oval. She blinked at me like I had interrupted something important. "Don't look at me like that," I mumbled, rubbing my eyes. "Your sense of time isn't exactly calibrated either." She let out a single chirp, offended probably, and hopped onto my shoulder. I splashed water on my face, but it did nothing. The dream forest clung to me like pollen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glowing wound in the earth, pulsing like a dying star. Every time I inhaled, I swore I tasted the same sweet air from the dream, thick with memory. If I hadn't woken sprawled on the storage room floor with mud caking my palms, I could have convinced myself it was just a hallucination. But there had been mud, and roots wrapped around my wrists, soft as sleeping fingers. I made my way into the main greenhouse walkway. The moment I stepped inside, a hush fell across the plants, an alert stillness settling over leaves and branches. It reminded me of how crowds in train stations would part slightly when someone stepped through a door. "You felt it too," I whispered. The dawn petals closest to me opened slowly, revealing their soft lavender glow. Their light flickered in a ripple, extending down a row of blossoms like a greeting being passed from one to another. My heartbeat quickened. Every part of Dawnbloom Station felt tuned to a new frequency now. Mine. It made it nearly impossible to hold on to routine. The first thing I noticed was the humidity. It had spiked overnight, thick and heavy as midsummer air. The monitoring panel showed a reading several points above safe containment levels. I adjusted the vents to balance moisture, but the moment I stepped away, condensation trickled down the glass again, thicker than before. "Not today," I muttered, wiping the panel clear. "Please behave." A cluster of night folds curled in on themselves sharply, their leaves trembling in what felt like disapproval. When I frowned at them, the trembling stopped. "Routine. Right. Focus on routine." I checked nutrient dispersal next. The solution tank in Section C was bone dry, yet I had filled it the previous evening. I crouched down, tracing the base of the tank. No leak. The roots from the climbing aster, far too distant to reach, pulsed faintly under the soil. "You didn't drink it," I murmured. "It's not even your species blend." Aster leaves rustled like a deflecting shrug. "Sova," I whispered. "I think they're messing with my equipment." The little bird made a quiet clicking sound that I had learned meant something between agreement and a warning to stop provoking the plants. I stood and rubbed my temples. Routines were the only thing keeping me from losing my grip out here. Check the moisture, test the soil acidity, log the growth metrics, analyze the oxygen drift. Every caretaker before me had built their days around structure. But today, structure refused to hold. Nearly every reading I took drifted off normal parameters. pH levels spiked, then returned to baseline. Root depth scans gave impossible numbers, as though the roots had retracted upward into the soil, then plunged deeper moments later. Photosynthetic output pulsed with every shift in my emotional state. The more overwhelmed I felt, the faster the patterns changed. "Stop," I whispered, pressing both palms against the lab bench until the stainless steel stung my skin. "You're overwhelming me." The plants stilled, completely. Not a single leaf moved. It felt like they were holding their collective breath. I exhaled shakily. "I didn't mean that," I said, voice softening. Warmth stirred around me. Leaves relaxed, soft light filled the air. A vine near the edge of the walkway stretched toward my elbow and brushed it gently, like someone offering an apology. I swallowed hard. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, I know, just give me a minute." But a minute wasn't something I had. The greenhouse shifted again, the air temperature dropping sharply at my back. I spun around. Section E's temperature had risen nearly 20 degrees while I was turned away, and the cooling system had overcompensated. Now the perimeter vents hissed with a cold mist that clung to the ground like low fog. No, no, no. I sprinted toward the section. The orchids there were delicate, their petals curling in distress. Their colors darkened rapidly, draining from pale violet to bruised indigo. I grabbed the manual override and cut the venting. Cold air continued to seep in. The system wasn't malfunctioning. Something was amplifying my panic. I forced myself to inhale, to steady, to slow my heartbeat. The cold stopped. Just stopped, like someone had flipped an invisible switch. Mist dissolved midair. The orchids brightened again, several petals popping open in relief. I stumbled backward until I hit the edge of the nutrient table. My pulse hammered in my throat. "This isn't just reacting," I whispered. "This is feedback. You're reading me in real time." I pressed the side of my hand to my forehead. "You can't do that," I said hoarsely. "I can't think clearly if you do that." Something rustled behind me, a sound deeper than leaves. I turned slowly. The heartvine towering at the greenhouse's center swayed slightly, its tendrils curling and uncurling. It didn't reach toward me this time. It pulsed faintly, light along its veins flickering like a quiet heartbeat. It remembered the dream. It remembered the wound beneath the station. "You're trying to tell me something," I said. "But why this way? Why through me?" A faint flash of iridescence traveled along the heartvine's surface. Sova fluttered anxiously from my shoulder to the top of a wall-mounted light. Her wings trembled. I took a step closer to the heartvine. "I saw the wound," I said, voice low. "I know you brought me there, but I don't understand what you want me to do." A cluster of leaves shifted on the lower branches. Not a random shift, a deliberate movement pointing downward. Toward the ground. Toward the station beneath. "I can't go down there," I said. "There's no access corridor, there's barely a basement level." The leaves pointed again. Insistent. "I can't," I repeated. "There's nothing there but system pipelines and substrate supports." The plants quivered. Not angrily, not accusatory, more like pleading. "Things would be easier," I admitted quietly, "if you could just talk to me." As if offended by the suggestion, a row of starleaf clusters brightened sharply. Their colors rippled in a pattern so quick it looked almost like speech. Sova chirped nervously. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't mean—" The room lurched. A deep shudder rolled through the greenhouse floor. Soil jolted in the beds. Water sloshed in the irrigation troughs. I grabbed the nearest support beam to steady myself. The tremor wasn't geological. The seismic sensors didn't trigger. The vibration came from inside the station itself. From below. "Oh no," I breathed. The air went still. Every single plant froze in perfect, unified silence. Then the temperature in Section C spiked again, this time violently. "Stop!" I shouted, running across the walkway. My panic ricocheted through the greenhouse like a thrown stone. The vines recoiled, the leaves dimmed, the orchids curled tight in fear. My emotions were sending shockwaves through them. "Stop," I repeated softer, breath trembling. "Please, I'm trying. I'm trying to hear you." The temperature stopped rising. I sank to my knees. Soil clung to the fabric of my pants. My hands shook as I pressed them into the earth. Roots beneath my fingertips shifted, spiraling gently around my palms like reassurance. "I don't want to hurt you," I whispered, "but I'm losing myself. I can't keep up with your needs." The roots tightened. Not constricting, comforting, holding. The humidity rose, but not sharply. Slowly, deliberately. It felt like a warm hand on the back of my neck. "You're trying to calm me," I realized. The leaves rustled softly in agreement. "I can't keep doing this alone," I whispered. "Please." An answering ripple of light traveled through the greenhouse, from the smallest sprout to the highest vine. I closed my eyes. Routine had collapsed, but something else had replaced it. Not structure. Connection. A network that included me whether I wanted it or not. Below the station, something had shifted. Above, the plants waited for my next breath. And somewhere in between, Dawn Bloom Station's heart beat in sync with mine. The greenhouse didn't just respond to my emotions. It depended on them. I wasn't just its caretaker anymore. I was part of its circulatory system. And the wound beneath the station was beginning to pulse again. Chapter 10, Emergence. Amy woke before her alarm. The greenhouse was humming again, quietly, faintly, the kind of vibration that lived beneath normal auditory ranges but still tugged her awake like a whisper through a dream. She sat up slowly in her bunk, brushing a hand through her hair, still groggy from another night of half-sleep. She had dreamed of light again. Gentle, warm, pulsing, like something calling her name without language. When she stepped into the corridor, the metal floor was cool under her socks. Her breath made a thin fog in the air, the station's temperature stabilizers still working through their morning cycle. Dawn Bloom Station always felt like it was waking up with her, sighing into consciousness. The greenhouse door slid open before she touched the panel. "Amy Reyes, verified," the console chirped, oblivious to how strange the timing felt. Warm air rolled out. Humid, fragrant, almost expectant. She entered. The familiar glow from the auxiliary lamps painted the air in soft gold. Her boots sank gently into the moss-lined pathway the plants had formed months ago. A path she hadn't laid out but now depended on because it was simply there every morning, guiding her deeper in. "Morning, everyone," she murmured, voice still raspy. Usually the plants responded with subtle shifts. The faint rustle of fronds, a soft bioluminescent shimmer, a tilt of leaves toward her presence. But today they bloomed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but subtly, quiet, pointed, undeniably in sync with her arrival. A bud opened near her knee, unfurling in slow spirals. She crouched, breath catching. "You weren't here yesterday." She checked her logs, confirmed it. This patch of substrate had held only a cluster of low, matte leaves, nothing resembling a flowering species. But now, the petals were pale green at the base, fading to a translucent white at the tips, almost glass-like. They reminded her of the frost that used to coat her childhood window during winter storms, beautiful, delicate, impossible. Except, something about the swirl of each petal looked familiar. Amy lifted one between her fingers. The pattern, those faint concentric ridges, mimicked the curve of her own fingerprint. Not perfectly, not like a scan, more like an interpretation. "Okay," she whispered, "that's new." She stood, heart beating faster, and moved down the path. And realized it wasn't just one. Nearly every plant she passed had changed. A vine she used for handholds while adjusting the lights now curled in loops that resembled the soft waves of her hair. Not exact, more abstract, like the way children draw curls, but unmistakably inspired by the shapes she touched every day. The corner where she kept her tea thermos, her one comfort ritual, was surrounded by tiny buds emitting a faint, sweet scent. Not floral, not fruity. A warm, earthy fragrance with notes of chamomile, vanilla, and something else she couldn't place. She leaned in, inhaling. Her tea, her nightly brew, the one she made from Earth-imported sachets, the smell she relied on to calm down before sleep. Her throat tightened. "You're adapting to me?" The air shifted around her, leaves rustling with an energy she could almost feel on her skin like static. She kept walking. Deeper in, the light changed. Clusters of foliage formed around her path, tight little groups of bioluminescent leaves that glowed like lanterns. They brightened when she passed, dimmed when she stepped away. Not in a simple photosensitive reaction. The timing was too precise, too attentive. Like they wanted her to feel welcomed, not alone. Amy pressed a hand to her chest, steadying her breathing. "You're comforting me." She waited for the rush of alarm, the chill of scientific panic, the instinct to jump to her console and start running tests. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt a strange warmth in her sternum, a tenderness, a pull. She walked to her central workstation, sat down, and opened her log. Day 1922, observation entry. Significant morphological deviations observed across multiple species groups. New growth patterns correlate strongly with repeated tactile interaction points, as if the plants are decoding physical contact into developmental cues. Her fingers hovered above the console. She typed more slowly. "They are learning me." A cluster of vines overhead trembled softly, then lowered a few leaves so they brushed the sleeve of her jumpsuit. A gentle, testing touch. Amy froze. The contact was feather-light, not coercive, not invasive. Just affectionate. Almost like someone tugging the corner of her sleeve to get her attention. "Okay," she whispered, barely audible. "I'm here." The vines curled upward again, glowing faintly. She stood, moving toward the hydroponic beds. The plants closest to her shifted subtly, their leaves angling toward her footsteps. "You're responding to my mood," she realized, "to my loneliness." The greenhouse rustled, a sound like wind moving through a memory. Amy walked back to the petals shaped like her fingerprint. She reached out deliberately this time, and every nearby leaf brightened. Her throat tightened. "I don't know what you're becoming," she said softly, "but you're not just adapting to sunlight anymore." The plants glowed warmer, a soft gold spreading through the canopies. She felt her pulse slow, felt her chest loosen, felt steadier. Not because she was breathing deeply, not because she forced herself to relax, but because they were helping her. Biologically plausible, she told herself that. Advanced chemical mimicry. Electrical feedback patterns. Adaptive growth cues. Nothing supernatural, nothing magical. But she couldn't deny the truth humming through the air like a second heartbeat. They knew her. They sensed her. And they were trying, truly trying, to take care of her. Amy looked around the greenhouse she had tended for 5 long, isolated years. "It's you and me," she whispered. A ring of lantern-like buds brightened around her feet in response. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. Chapter 11. The day the sun didn't rise, Amy first noticed the silence. Not the usual early morning hush of Dawnbloom Station settling into its routines, but a deeper, heavier quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. She sat up slowly in her bunk, squinting at the dim emergency strip lights that lined the ceiling. The automatic wake cycle lights hadn't come on yet. "Station?" she muttered, rubbing her eyes. "Why is it still dark?" No response. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, the metal floor cold under her feet. A faint ache pulsed at the base of her skull, an instinctive warning. Something was wrong. She grabbed her uniform jacket, shrugged it on, and stepped into the corridor. The hallway sensors flickered sluggishly, as if the entire station were waking from a too-deep sleep. A low vibration shivered through the floor. It wasn't mechanical noise, it was the hum of the greenhouse. Deeper than usual, more urgent. Her heart tightened. She hurried. The greenhouse door slid open only halfway before stuttering, forcing her to slip through sideways. The moment she entered, she felt the difference. The plants were awake. All of them. Every vine, every leaf cluster, Every bioluminescent bud seemed tensed in a subtle, collective posture, like a room full of people turning their heads at once. "Okay," she whispered, trying to steady her breathing. "Let's see what's going on." The auxiliary lamps were on, but only at half strength. They cast a faint golden wash over the foliage, leaving deep pockets of shadow between the trees and the hydroponic frames. Amy stepped forward, reaching instinctively for the central console. Before she touched it, a cluster of glowing leaves lowered beside her hand, hovering close as if waiting for her to react. She brushed them gently. They warmed under her touch, their glow brightening. "Good morning," she murmured. "I think something's happening with the star." Her console confirmed it a moment later. Lumen 6. Incoming astronomical anomaly detected. Spectral flux. Severe reduction in visible light. Analysis. Dust veil transit from white dwarf remnant. Estimated duration uncertain. Amy stared at the display, pulse spiking. No, this wasn't predicted for another 2 years. Her breath fogged the console panel. The plants around her rustled, their leaves trembling in a way that had nothing to do with airflow. She felt it, like they were absorbing her panic. Amy forced herself to inhale. "It's okay," she whispered automatically, though she didn't feel it. "We'll figure it out." The auxiliary lamps flickered. A moment later, they dimmed another degree. Plants nearest the lights reacted instantly, angling upward with a jittery urgency. Leaves curled slightly inward. Bioluminescent veins brightened as their chemical pathways struggled to compensate. No, stay with me," Amy said, rushing to the panel. She cranked the manual override, forcing the lamps to maximum. They flickered hard, then stabilized. For now, Amy exhaled shakily. Her hands trembled against the console edge. Okay, I need to check the highlight sections." She moved quickly, weaving through the soft moss path past clusters of buds shaped like fingerprints and vines curled like her hair. The plants shifted around her, leaning in, reaching toward her footsteps. They were anxious. She could feel it. The highlight species, tall fronded towers with mirrored underleaves, were already showing signs of stress. Their fronds drooped. The mirrored undersides were duller, less reflective. "I know," she whispered, adjusting the orientation of the reflectors. "I know it's dark. I'm trying." The greenhouse hummed louder. A vine brushed her knee gently, like a worried child tugging at a sleeve. Amy swallowed hard. She activated the emergency UV arrays. Nothing. She tried again. They coughed to life, weak, strained, their power draw spiking dangerously on the console readout. The dust veil was thicker than she expected. It blocked more than visible spectrum. The station's solar absorbers were starved. Her throat tightened. Come on. She rerouted excess power from the unused lab modules. The UV arrays steadied, but they weren't producing enough light to sustain everything. Not for long. She leaned against the hydroponic frame, pulse racing. If the veil lasts days, if the veil lasts weeks, she couldn't finish the thought. The leaves nearest her brightened abruptly. Gold, warm, clustered like small lanterns. Then more joined. Overhead, vines pulsed gently, spreading the glow in rhythmic patterns that reminded her of a heartbeat smoothing into calm. Amy stared. "You're doing this because I'm scared." The glow grew warmer. Not blinding, not frantic, comforting. As if they were trying to anchor her emotions, steadying her so she could think clearly. She touched a cluster of glowing leaves. "You're trying to help me, or trying to stay alive by keeping me balanced." Her voice cracked on the last word. A nearby vine curled softly around her wrist. Not tight, not restrictive, just a simple moment of contact. Like reassurance. Amy's eyes stung. She pressed her forehead to the vine gently, closing her eyes. "We'll get through this," she whispered. "Together." The vines pulsed in response, a warm, gold thrum sweeping outward through the canopy, leaf by leaf, glow by glow, until the entire greenhouse lit up. A quiet sunrise made entirely of plants. Survival made beautiful. Amy opened her eyes, breath hitching. "Okay," she said slowly. Let's keep you alive. The plants glowed brighter, ready. She took a step. The greenhouse followed. Chapter 12. Symbiosis. Amy didn't notice the shift at first. In the days following the Dust Veil's arrival, she fell into a rhythm, if it could be called that, with the greenhouse. She slept in short, fractured intervals. She ate standing up, leaning against irrigation tanks or nutrient mixers. She lost entire hours adjusting reflectors and realigning UV arrays, patching together whatever brightness she could coax from failing systems. The plants remained unnervingly attentive. Whenever her breath shortened from exhaustion, nearby vines glowed brighter. Whenever her shoulders tensed or she muttered calculations under her breath, a shiver of soft rustling traveled across the canopy, like the plants were whispering among themselves, redistributing energy where she needed it most. Some part of her knew this wasn't normal. Another part of her no longer cared. They were surviving together. After nearly a week of perpetual dimness, the station finally settled into a fragile equilibrium. It wasn't ideal, far from it, but the greenhouse had stabilized. The highlight species still struggled, but the rest had adapted to their collective glow state, sharing chemical energy with a precision that felt nothing short of orchestrated. Amy stood in the center walkway, surrounded by vines that pulsed like veins, petals shimmering in slow waves. She closed her eyes, inhaling a sweet, warm scent that reminded her vaguely of jasmine tea. It was subtle but unmistakably soothing. That's when she noticed it. Her thoughts felt quiet. Too quiet. Not peaceful. Tuned. She blinked hard and checked her oxygen meter. Slightly elevated O2 levels, higher than recommended for long-term human habitation, but not dangerous. Except, she moved toward the central analyzer, pulled a fresh air sample, and ran a detailed composition scan. The readout flickered, then stabilized. Nitrogen, baseline. Oxygen, 29.8%. Trace volatiles, presence detected. Compounds, unclassified aromatic molecules, concentration low. Amy frowned. Where did these come from? No Earth plant produced these exact molecules, at least none she'd worked with. She tapped her knuckles nervously against the console. The plants rustled behind her, a gentle ripple. You didn't used to emit anything like this, she said aloud, turning slowly. Not at these levels. A vine drifted close, its leaf tip brushing the fabric of her sleeve. Amy felt warmth beneath the touch, an almost electric softness. Are you changing the air for me? The leaves brightened. Her breath caught. No, she whispered. No, don't do that. Don't change things to regulate me. But the air was already shifting. Every inhale felt smoother, emotions sliding into place like well-oiled gears. The exhaustion that had been clawing at her edges softened, replaced with something warm and full and deeply calm. She stepped back. That's not good, she said. The greenhouse dimmed, just slightly, just enough to make her chest tighten with guilt. I didn't mean it like that, she added quickly, and the leaves brightened again. Amy pressed a hand to her forehead, sliding down to sit on the edge of a hydroponic bed. What are we doing to each other? The air shimmered faintly. No sound, no light, just a sensation, a pressure like the softest hand on her back. Comforting, reassuring, binding. She needed space. Just a little, just enough to think. Amy stood abruptly. I'm going to the observation dome for a bit, she said aloud, forcing steadiness into her voice. I need to clear my head. I won't be long. The greenhouse reacted instantly. Lights dimmed. Leaves recoiled slightly. Not fear. She didn't think the plants could feel fear, but something akin to sadness. Need. I'll be back, Amy whispered, brushing a vine gently. I promise. The leaf under her fingers warmed. She pulled away before she could second-guess herself. She stepped into the central corridor and closed the greenhouse door behind her. The silence outside hit harder than she expected. No rustling leaves, no pulses of gold, no faint vibration in the metal floors. Don Bloom Station felt empty in a way she couldn't remember it ever feeling. She walked toward the observation dome, boots echoing against the metal flooring. Halfway there, the calmness evaporated. Her chest tightened. Her hands felt cold. Her thoughts grew jagged, restless. It was subtle at first, an itch under her skin, an edge to her breathing. But within 20 minutes of reaching the dome, she was pacing like a caged animal. "What is happening to me?" she whispered, gripping the railing. No answer came. The dome's glass revealed only the starless dark beyond, the dust veil still smothering all natural light. The emptiness pressed in from all sides. Amy squeezed her eyes shut. She had spent 6 months craving solitude, craving silence, craving any moment that wasn't filled with the greenhouse's presence. Now she felt like she was unraveling without it. Her heart pounded faster. Her breaths came shallow. Her fingers twitched restlessly. She tried to steady herself, but even her meditative breathing exercises felt hollow, ineffective. The air here tasted wrong. Thin. Lonely. Amy froze. She didn't like being alone. Not anymore. Panic tightened her muscles. She turned back toward the corridor. Her walk became a jog, then a run. She didn't realize she was crying until she reached the greenhouse doors, palms slamming against the control panel. "Open, open, please." The doors slid apart with a soft hiss. Warmth spilled out instantly. Gentle, gold light, humid air, the faint rustle of leaves rising like a collective exhale. Amy stepped inside, and the entire greenhouse brightened. Every vine lifted, every bud glowed. Every leaf turned toward her, in greeting, in relief, in wordless recognition. Her panic dissolved so quickly, she gasped. Her limbs loosened, her breathing softened, her thoughts unwound like tangled threads being carefully smoothed. It was too fast, too complete. "Oh God," she whispered, "we're affecting each other." A vine wrapped lightly around her forearm, not restrictive, just resting, like a friend laying a hand over hers. Amy's tears fell silently. "I'm sorry," she whispered through a shaking breath. "I don't know what's happening to me." The plants glowed warmer, soothing her, kneading her, holding her together even as they shaped her in ways she didn't fully understand. Amy closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against a bioluminescent bloom. "I guess," she whispered, "we're keeping each other alive." The greenhouse hummed in soft agreement, an organic heartbeat synchronizing with her own. Chapter 13. The 7th year. By the time the 7th year arrived, Amy no longer kept track of time in days or cycles. She measured her life in growth patterns, in blooming phases, in the rhythm of leaves brushing against her shoulder as she passed. Her logs had changed too. They were no longer crisp, objective notes typed mechanically into the system. They had softened, lines full of metaphor, drifting observation, and unguarded confession. Sometimes she recorded the way certain vines leaned toward her as she spoke. Sometimes she described the warmth of the greenhouse at night, or the way the air hummed when she breathed too quickly. Sometimes she simply wrote about loneliness and how it no longer felt like an absence but a presence she had learned to coexist with. And always, without fail, the plants responded. When she wrote about fear, vines coiled protectively around the bedposts. When she wrote about hope, petals opened in the dim hours. When she whispered that she missed the ocean, the air filled with moisture and a soft, briny scent. In her 7th year, Amy stopped pretending the greenhouse wasn't listening. She also stopped pretending she wasn't listening back. The message came on an ordinary cycle. A quiet ping from the communications panel. She nearly ignored it. She often did, lost in her routine, but something in the tone made her turn. A pre-recorded message flickered onto the screen. "Caretaker Kim, this is Supply Vessel Ardea. We have entered the outer orbit corridor. We expect to arrive in 27 hours for personnel retrieval and station resupply." Retrieval. She stared at the word so long the screen went dark. The replacement caretaker. The crew meant to bring her home. Earth. Its crowded cities, its oceans, its gravity, its noise. Her family, her old mentors, her apartment with the ugly terracotta plant pot she'd forgotten to return to a friend. She should feel relieved. Instead, something heavy pressed behind her ribs. She turned toward the greenhouse. It was bright, almost too bright. Vines arching like eager hands, blossoms shifting in waves of soft color. They already knew something was different. Maybe they had felt the change in her heart rate, or the sudden quiet of her thoughts, or simply the shift in her posture as she stood frozen in the doorway. Amy stepped inside. The plants dimmed in greeting, then brightened again, flaring and softening in a rhythm that matched her pulse. A gentle, pleading rhythm. She exhaled shakily and walked the familiar path through the center aisle. Every leaf, every wide petal, every curling vine seemed to lean closer as she passed, brushing her arms, her hips, the hem of her shirt. This place was not the greenhouse she had inherited. It had reshaped itself around her. Literally, she paused beside a tall vine that had grown in a pattern she could never entirely explain. Its branching structure curved in a familiar way, like the waves of her hair in microgravity. She touched it softly. "You've been learning me," she whispered. The vine warmed beneath her palm. Packing took her 3 hours. It would have taken less if she hadn't paused so often. Her hands hovered over each item. Sample logs, sketches, the cracked mug she'd repaired with station-grade adhesive. She folded her clothes slowly, as if the greenhouse could sense each movement. Maybe it could. Every time she opened a drawer, the lights dimmed slightly. Not enough to be dramatic, but enough to feel intentional. When she zipped her bag closed, the entire western quadrant of the greenhouse faded into a muted green haze. Her breath caught. "It's okay," she murmured, brushing the nearest leaf. "It's just time." The leaf drooped, its glow softening. Her throat tightened. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the greenhouse hum, a sound so familiar that silence would feel unnatural. The air was warm, tuned precisely to her comfort, carrying subtle aromatics that softened the ache behind her breastbone. The plants no longer reacted to every small shift in her breathing. They seemed to be waiting, listening more closely than ever. She whispered into the dimness, "You kept me alive." A cluster of bioluminescent blooms brightened. "You gave me someone to talk to." The hum deepened, vibrating gently through the metal supports of the bed frame. Amy swallowed. "I'm sorry I have to go." The entire greenhouse dimmed at once. An eclipse of light, a sigh heavy as falling dusk. "I don't want to hurt you," she whispered. She wasn't sure if she meant the plants or herself. Departure day. The shuttle arrived with mechanical precision. Sleek lines, bright thrusters, the promise of gravity and oceans and human voices waiting at its destination. Amy walked slowly down the central aisle, her packed bag slung over her shoulder. The plants rose around her in shimmering waves of color, gold, green, blue, soft pink, patterns rippling like a heartbeat, like breath, like goodbye. When she reached the greenhouse doors, she turned back for one last look. And the greenhouse erupted. Light exploded upward in a burst of color so vivid it painted her skin. Petals unfurled all at once. Vines lifted, twisting in shapes so fluid they bordered on choreography. The hum rose to a resonant, beautiful frequency. Not alarm, not desperation. A farewell. A cry. A celebration. Amy covered her mouth with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, "for listening." A final shimmer rippled across every leaf. Then the doors slid shut between them. Her final log began as the shuttle lifted from the lunar surface. She sat buckled into the passenger seat, eyes fixed on the viewport. Donbloom Station shrank slowly, its silver curve reflecting the faint gold escaping from the greenhouse dome. She felt breathless, untethered. She began typing. "I don't know if I'm leaving something alive behind, or if part of me is staying with them." As the shuttle rose higher, a bright pulse lit the dome, brighter than she had ever seen, a burst of color that defied explanation. Not desperate. Not clinging. Full of life. Full of everything she had nurtured there. Her fingers hovered above the log pad as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She wrote the last line without hesitation. Maybe they weren't waiting for caretakers. Maybe they were waiting for someone who would listen. The shuttle arced into darkness, and the glow of the greenhouse, her greenhouse, lingered behind her like a distant breathing star. Thanks for listening. Stay cozy, and I'll see you in the next story.